photograph sat in a cardboard box for 124 years, waiting for someone to look closely enough to see the truth. Dr. Elizabeth Hartman didn't know that when she pulled it from the dusty collection donated to the Chicago Historical Society on a cold Monday morning in March. The image showed what appeared to be an ordinary American family from 1901. A stern-faced father with a thick mustache, a mother with her hands folded neatly in her lap, and 3 children arranged in descending height. But it was the empty chair positioned deliberately at the edge of the frame that would change everything Elizabeth thought she understood about justice. The chair sat there, vacant and ominous, its wooden back catching the light from the photographer's flash powder. At first, Elizabeth had dismissed it as a simple compositional choice, perhaps left empty for a family member who couldn't attend the sitting. But something about the way the family member's eyes seemed to avoid that side of the room made her pause. She held the sepia-toned photograph up to the fluorescent light, squinting at the details that decades of storage had begun to fade. The donation had come from the estate of a woman named Margaret Whitmore, who had died at 93 without any living relatives. The Historical Society received boxes of correspondence, journals, household items, and photographs spanning 3 generations. Elizabeth had been cataloguing the Whitmore collection for 2 weeks, finding nothing particularly remarkable. Victorian-era families, letters discussing mundane social events, recipes, property deeds, standard archival material that would eventually be digitized and made available to researchers. But this photograph felt different. She couldn't explain why, but her instincts, honed over 15 years of historical research, told her to look closer. She carried the image to her desk and switched on the high-intensity lamp she used for detailed examination work. Under the bright light, she noticed something she'd missed before. The shadows in the photograph weren't quite right. Near the empty chair in the corner of the room, there was a darkness that seemed too deep, too deliberate. Elizabeth reached for her magnifying glass, the same one she'd used to authenticate countless historical documents. As she moved the lens slowly across the photograph's surface, her breath caught in her throat. There, barely visible in the shadows behind the empty chair, was the outline of something that shouldn't be there. It looked like fabric, crumpled and dark, bunched against the wall. And extending from that fabric was what appeared to be a hand, small, pale, fingers slightly curled. Her heart began to race as she adjusted the magnifying glass, trying to bring the image into sharper focus. The hand was definitely there, partially hidden but unmistakable once you knew to look for it. And if there was a hand, then there had to be an arm, a body, a person concealed in that corner. Elizabeth sat back in her chair, her mind reeling with implications. Who was hiding in that photograph? Why would someone remain concealed during a family portrait? She glanced at the faces of the family members again, studying their expressions with new understanding. The father's stern countenance now seemed less about Victorian formality and more about tension. The mother's folded hands appeared rigid, her knuckles white even in the faded image. The children, arranged so carefully by height, all shared the same uncomfortable expression. Eyes forward, mouths set in thin lines, shoulders stiff. They knew. Every person in that photograph knew someone was hiding in the corner, and they had deliberately posed to obscure whoever it was. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she set down the magnifying glass. This wasn't just an interesting historical artifact anymore. This was potentially evidence of something dark, something that had been hidden for more than a century. She needed to enhance the image, to see clearly what the shadows were concealing. The Historical Society had recently acquired digital scanning equipment capable of revealing details invisible to the naked eye. She would start there, tomorrow morning, first thing, but tonight she would research the Whitmore family, searching for any hint of scandal or tragedy that might explain what she'd discovered in their carefully staged portrait. Elizabeth arrived at the Historical Society before sunrise, unable to sleep after discovering the hidden figure in the photograph. She'd spent most of the night searching through online genealogy databases and historical records, finding surprisingly little information about the Whitmore family of Chicago. According to census records, Jonathan Whitmore had been a successful textile merchant who owned a large home in what was then one of Chicago's most prestigious neighborhoods. His wife, Catherine, had been active in various charitable organizations, Their 3 children, Jonathan Jr., Mary, and Thomas, had all survived to adulthood, which was remarkable for that era. But after 1902, the family seemed to vanish from all public records. The house where they'd lived had been sold in 1903 to settle debts, according to property records Elizabeth found in the county archives. There was no indication of where the family had gone, no death certificates filed in Cook County, no further census entries. It was as if the Whitmores had simply ceased to exist after that photograph was taken. Elizabeth found this disappearance almost as disturbing as the hidden figure in the corner of their parlor. She set up the photograph on the scanning bed of the Society's new digital equipment, a machine that cost more than her annual salary and could detect details in historical documents that conventional photography would miss. As the scanner's light bar moved slowly across the image, Elizabeth watched the monitor as the photograph appeared in stunning high resolution. She zoomed in on the corner, where she'd seen the hand, her pulse quickening as the shadows resolved into clearer shapes. What she saw made her stomach turn. The hand she'd noticed wasn't just visible, it was attached to an arm that disappeared into a crumpled dark dress. And now, with the enhanced resolution, she could see more. A portion of a face turned toward the wall, long hair splayed across shoulders. This was a young woman, perhaps in her late teens or early 20s, positioned in a way that suggested she wasn't voluntarily hiding. Her body was slumped, lifeless, pressed into the corner as if someone had tried to conceal her presence during the photograph. Elizabeth printed several copies of the enhanced image and stared at them, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. Had this woman been dead when the photograph was taken? Was this evidence of a murder that had gone unnoticed for over a century? She thought about the empty chair, positioned so deliberately at the edge of the frame. Now it seemed less like a vacant seat and more like a marker, a deliberate inclusion that drew the eye away from the corner where the real secret lay hidden. The Whitmore family had posed for this portrait, knowing a body was concealed behind them. The audacity of it was staggering. She needed help. This was beyond her expertise as a historian. Elizabeth picked up her phone and called Dr. Robert Morrison, a colleague at Northwestern University who specialized in forensic analysis of historical photographs. She'd worked with him before on authentication projects, and she trusted his discretion. When she explained what she'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Robert finally spoke, his voice careful and measured. He would come to the Historical Society immediately, and he suggested they might need to contact law enforcement, even though the potential crime had occurred more than a century ago. While Elizabeth waited for Robert to arrive, she continued searching for information about the Whitmore family. She found a brief mention in a Society column from November 1901, noting that the Whitmores had departed Chicago rather suddenly for an extended European tour. The columnist expressed surprise at their hasty departure and noted that several social obligations had been left unfulfilled. Elizabeth cross-referenced this with ship passenger records, but found no evidence that the Whitmores had actually sailed to Europe. Another lie, another misdirection. What had this family done that required them to fabricate an entire overseas journey? Robert Morrison arrived within the hour, his expression grave as Elizabeth showed him the enhanced photographs. He examined them carefully, using his own magnifying equipment and taking several measurements. After nearly 30 minutes of silent analysis, he looked up at Elizabeth with troubled eyes. "The positioning of this figure suggests concealment," he said quietly, "and based on the way the body appears to be slumped, I would say this person was either deceased or unconscious when this photograph was taken." They stood together in the quiet archive room, two historians suddenly confronted with evidence of a crime that had been hidden in plain sight for generations, preserved in a family photograph that should have been nothing more than an artifact of Victorian domestic life. Detective Sarah Rodriguez of the Chicago Police Department's Cold Case Unit had seen many unusual requests during her 15-year career, but being asked to investigate a photograph from 1901 was definitely a first. When Elizabeth and Robert contacted her department, their discovery was initially met with skepticism. However, the enhanced images they provided were compelling enough to warrant an official investigation. Sarah agreed to meet them at the Historical Society, bringing along Officer Michael Park, a specialist in digital forensics, who had recently joined the cold case unit after working several years in the technology crimes division. Sarah examined the photographs with the detached professionalism that came from years of viewing crime scene evidence. Officer Park loaded the digital files onto his laptop and began running them through enhancement software even more sophisticated than what the Historical Society possessed. As they worked, Elizabeth provided all the information she'd gathered about the Whitmore family. Sarah took notes, her expression growing more serious as the pattern emerged. A wealthy family disappearing suddenly, fabricated explanations, no trace after 1902. These were the hallmarks of people fleeing something, possibly justice. And if the figure in the photograph was indeed a victim, then the Whitmores had committed a crime audacious enough to require complete reinvention of their lives. Officer Park's software revealed even more disturbing details. He isolated the figure in the corner and applied various filters that removed the interference of shadow and age. The woman, and it was definitely a woman, appeared to be wearing a servant's dress, simple and dark. Her face, though partially obscured, showed no signs of the rigid, posed expression common in photographs of that era. Her jaw was slack, her eyes closed. "This is consistent with post-mortem photography," Park said quietly, except that the subject was clearly not the intended focus of the portrait. In Victorian times, families often photographed their deceased loved ones as a final memorial. But this woman wasn't being memorialized, she was being hidden. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. If we're correct about what this photograph shows, then we're looking at evidence of a homicide that occurred over 120 years ago. The question is whether there's enough evidence to identify the victim and determine what happened to her. Elizabeth mentioned that she'd found very little about the Whitmore family after 1902, which Sarah found both significant and frustrating. People who disappeared that completely usually had help. Money, connections, possibly assistance from others who had something to gain from their silence. She made a decision. "We're going to treat this as an active investigation, at least until we can determine definitively whether a crime occurred." The team divided responsibilities. Elizabeth would continue researching the Whitmore family, looking for any connections to other families, business associates, or social organizations that might provide leads. Robert would analyze the photograph itself, trying to determine the exact date it was taken and whether there were any other details that might help identify the victim. Officer Park would search historical police records for any reports of missing persons from that time period, focusing particularly on young women who might have been servants in wealthy households. Sarah would coordinate the investigation and handle any legal issues that might arise from examining evidence so old that it existed in a grey area of jurisdiction. As they worked over the following days, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Officer Park discovered that in the years between 1899 and 1902, at least 7 young women had been reported missing in Chicago, all of them immigrants who had worked as domestic servants. The reports had been filed by family members, mostly brothers or fathers who had come looking for sisters or daughters who had stopped writing letters home. In each case, the police investigation had been minimal. These were poor immigrants with no social standing, and their disappearances were largely dismissed as women who had run away or moved to other cities seeking different employment. The reports were filed and forgotten, gathering dust in archives, just like the Whitmore photograph. Elizabeth made a breakthrough when she found a reference to the Whitmores in a private diary held by the Chicago Historical Society. The diary belonged to a society matron named Virginia Ashworth, who had been active in the same charitable circles as Catherine Whitmore. In an entry from October 1901, Virginia wrote about a disturbing rumor circulating among the ladies of her acquaintance. She mentioned whispers about the Whitmore household, about servants who arrived but never seemed to leave, about strange sounds heard by neighbors late at night. Virginia noted that she had stopped accepting invitations to the Whitmore home because she found the atmosphere there unsettling. She wrote that Catherine Whitmore seemed frightened, constantly nervous, and that the children appeared subdued in a way that suggested more than strict Victorian discipline. This diary entry gave Sarah the context she needed. The Whitmores weren't just a family concealing a single crime. They were potentially involved in something much larger and more sinister. The empty chair in the photograph took on new meaning. Perhaps it represented all the absent servants, all the young women who had entered that household and never emerged. The family had posed for their portraits surrounded by evidence of their crimes, so confident in their power and position that they believed they would never be held accountable. The breakthrough came when Officer Park cross-referenced the missing person reports with employment records from domestic service agencies operating in Chicago at the turn of the century. He discovered that 4 of the 7 missing women had been placed in positions through the same agency, Harrison Domestic Services, which had operated out of an office on State Street. The agency's records, miraculously preserved in a warehouse that had been converted to a document storage facility, showed that all 4 women had been sent to work for families in the same wealthy neighborhood where the Whitmores had lived. And one of those women, a young Irish immigrant named Bridget Sullivan, had been sent specifically to the Whitmore household in January 1901. Sarah felt the familiar rush of a case beginning to break open as she examined Bridget Sullivan's employment file. The agency had recorded her age as 19, her previous experience as domestic service in New York, and a note that she had excellent references. There was also a physical description: small build, dark hair, pale complexion. Sarah compared this description to the enhanced photograph of the figure hidden in the Whitmore parlor. The height seemed consistent, the dark hair matched. She needed more, but this was the first real connection between a specific missing person and the Whitmore family. Officer Park found additional records showing that Bridget's brother, Patrick Sullivan, had filed a missing person report in March 1901, stating that his sister had failed to appear at an arranged meeting and that her letters had stopped arriving at their family home in Ireland. Patrick's report included heartbreaking details. He had saved for 2 years to bring Bridget to America, hoping she could earn money to help support their large family back in County Cork. She had been faithful about sending letters every 2 weeks, describing her work and her hopes for the future. When the letters stopped, Patrick had traveled to Chicago from New York to find her. He had gone to the Whitmore house and been told by Jonathan Whitmore himself that Bridget had left their employment without notice, providing no forwarding address. Patrick had begged the police to investigate, but his report had been filed and ignored. He returned to New York, and according to records Elizabeth found, he spent the rest of his life searching for his sister, placing notices in newspapers and writing to immigration authorities, never knowing what had happened to the young woman he had worked so hard to help. Robert Morrison made his own discovery while examining the photograph through spectral analysis. By isolating specific wavelengths of light, he could see details that were completely invisible in normal viewing. What he found made the team gather urgently around his computer screen. On the wall behind the empty chair, barely visible even with enhancement, were marks that looked like scratches, deep gouges in the wallpaper and plaster underneath. Robert enlarged the section, and the scratches resolved into something that made Sarah's blood run cold. They were letters, carved frantically into the wall. The letters spelled out a single word: help. The investigation took on a new urgency. This wasn't just evidence of a crime anymore. This was a message from the victim herself, a desperate attempt to leave some trace that she had existed, that she had fought for her life. Sarah contacted forensic archaeologists at the University of Chicago, explaining the situation and asking whether it might be possible to locate the former Whitmore property and conduct an excavation. The house itself had been demolished in the 1950s to make way for modern development, but property records gave them the exact location. If there were remains buried on that property, modern technology might be able to locate them. While they waited for the university's response, Elizabeth discovered another crucial piece of evidence. Among the Whitmore family papers were several letters from Jonathan Whitmore's business partner, a man named Charles Hendricks. The letters, written in careful business language, contained phrases that seemed innocuous on the surface, but took on sinister meaning in light of what they now knew. References to problems being handled discreetly, to arrangements being made for disposal of unwanted inventory, to ensuring that loose ends were properly managed. Elizabeth realized that the letters were written in code, a way for the business partners to communicate about their crimes while maintaining plausible deniability if the letters were ever discovered. She found a particularly damning letter dated March 10, 1901, just days after Bridget Sullivan's brother, had filed his missing person report. Charles wrote to Jonathan expressing concern about the recent inquiry and suggesting that perhaps it was time to consider relocating their operations to a location with less scrutiny. This letter was the closest thing they had to a confession. It proved that Jonathan Whitmore and his business partner were aware they were under potential investigation and that they had taken steps to avoid detection. Sarah began searching for information about Charles Hendricks, hoping he might lead them to more evidence. What she found was another family that had disappeared from Chicago records around the same time as the Whitmores, another trail that went cold in 1902. The pattern was clear now. The Whitmores and the Hendricks families had been involved in something terrible, something that had required them to abandon their entire lives and disappear. The photograph that Elizabeth had discovered wasn't just evidence of one crime. It was a window into a series of crimes that had been hidden for over a century. And the empty chair, positioned so deliberately in that family portrait, was Jonathan Whitmore's arrogant signature on his crimes. A public display of power, a statement that he could do whatever he wanted and never face consequences. But he had been wrong. Justice, it seemed, could wait patiently in a cardboard box for 124 years, and when it finally emerged, it would not be denied. The University of Chicago's forensic archaeology team arrived at the site of the former Whitmore property on a grey Tuesday morning in April. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who led the team, had initially been skeptical about the project. Searching for remains from a crime committed over a century ago seemed like an impossible task. But the enhanced photographs and the documentary evidence Elizabeth and Sarah had compiled convinced her to at least conduct a preliminary survey. The site was now occupied by a small commercial building and parking lot, making excavation complicated. However, ground-penetrating radar could reveal anomalies beneath the concrete without requiring extensive digging. Dr. Walsh's team set up their equipment and began methodical scans of the area that corresponded to where the Whitmore house had stood. The radar sent electromagnetic pulses into the ground, creating detailed images of what lay beneath the surface. For hours, the team moved their equipment in careful grids, recording data that would later be analyzed. Sarah and Elizabeth watched from a distance, both feeling the weight of what they might discover. If there were remains, it would confirm their worst suspicions, but it would also provide closure for families who had spent generations wondering what happened to their missing daughters and sisters. The results came back 3 days later. Dr. Walsh called an emergency meeting at the Historical Society, her expression somber. The ground-penetrating radar had revealed 6 distinct anomalies in the area that would have been the Whitmore property's backyard. The anomalies showed density patterns consistent with human remains, buried approximately 4 to 6 feet below the current surface. All 6 were located in what historical property maps indicated had been a garden area, conveniently disguised by landscaping that the Whitmores had installed in 1900. Dr. Walsh explained that the radar couldn't provide absolute confirmation without excavation, but the patterns were unmistakable to someone experienced in forensic archaeology. Sarah immediately began the complex process of obtaining permits for excavation. Despite the age of the potential crime, the discovery of possible human remains required full legal procedures. She contacted the Cook County State's Attorney's Office, explaining the situation and providing all the evidence they had compiled. The case was unusual enough that it attracted attention from senior prosecutors who saw it as an opportunity to demonstrate that justice had no statute of limitations. Within 2 weeks, all necessary permits were approved and excavation was scheduled to begin. The dig began on a Monday morning in early May. Dr. Walsh's team worked with painstaking care, removing layers of concrete, filled dirt, and compacted soil. News media had gotten wind of the investigation, and camera crews lined the perimeter of the site, documenting what was being called the most significant cold case discovery in Chicago history. Elizabeth stood with Robert Morrison, watching as the archaeologists carefully excavated the first anomaly site. The work was slow and meticulous, each layer photographed and documented before being removed. On the 3rd day of excavation, they found the first remains. Dr. Walsh called Sarah over, her voice steady, but her eyes revealing the emotion she felt. The skeleton was small, female, positioned in a way that suggested hasty burial. The remains were remarkably well preserved due to the soil conditions, and forensic examination would be able to determine age, approximate time of death, and possibly cause. But what made everyone at the site fall silent was what they found with the skeleton. Around the neck bones was a delicate chain with a small pendant. The pendant was tarnished, but still identifiable as a Celtic cross. Elizabeth's breath caught. Patrick Sullivan's missing person report had mentioned that his sister Bridget wore such a pendant, a gift from their mother before she left Ireland. The discovery of Bridget Sullivan's remains transformed the investigation from historical mystery into a major criminal case, despite the fact that everyone involved was long dead. Over the following 2 weeks, Dr. Walsh's team excavated all 6 burial sites. Each contained the skeletal remains of a young woman, all between the ages of 18 and 25, based on forensic analysis. Each had been buried hastily, without coffins or formal burial rites, and each had died violently. The forensic pathologist brought in to examine the remains found evidence of trauma consistent with strangulation in 4 cases, blunt force trauma in 1, and what appeared to be poisoning in another. Sarah worked with Officer Park to match the remains to missing person reports from the period. It was heartbreaking work, reading the desperate pleas from family members who had searched fruitlessly for their daughters and sisters. In addition to Bridget Sullivan, they were able to identify 3 other victims. Anna Kowalski, a Polish immigrant who had disappeared in August 1900, Mary Chen, a Chinese woman who vanished in December 1900, and Elena Rodriguez from Mexico, who had been reported missing in June 1901. The other 2 victims remained unidentified, their families having left no records that survived the intervening century. Elizabeth continued researching the Whitmore and Hendricks families, trying to understand how they had managed to disappear so completely. She found the answer in ship passenger records from late 1902. The families hadn't fled to Europe as the Society columns had suggested. They had sailed to Argentina under assumed names, taking advantage of that country's lax immigration policies and its unwillingness to extradite criminals wanted by American authorities. Jonathan Whitmore had become James Worth, a British textile merchant relocating to Buenos Aires. Charles Hendricks had transformed into Thomas Hartford, an American investor seeking opportunities in South American markets. The 2 families had lived in Argentina for decades, maintaining their false identities and building new lives on the foundation of their crimes. Elizabeth traced their descendants through Argentine genealogical records. Some of those descendants were still alive, living in Buenos Aires with no knowledge of their ancestors' dark history. Sarah faced a difficult decision. Should she contact these descendants and inform them that their great-great-grandfathers had been serial killers? She ultimately decided that transparency was necessary, both for the sake of the victims' families and for historical accuracy. The truth had been hidden long enough. The story broke internationally when Sarah held a press conference revealing the full scope of the investigation. The photographs of the burial sites, the enhanced images showing Bridget Sullivan's body concealed in the family portrait, and the documentary evidence of the Whitmore's crimes created a media sensation. News outlets around the world covered the story of the century-old murders finally being exposed. In Argentina, the descendants of Jonathan Whitmore and Charles Hendricks were shocked by the revelations. Some refused to believe it, insisting that there must be some mistake. Others expressed remorse for crimes committed by ancestors they had never known. The photograph that had started everything became the centerpiece of a major exhibition at the Chicago Historical Society. Elizabeth curated the exhibition titled Hidden Crimes, Justice Delayed but Not Denied. The display included the original photograph, the enhanced images showing Bridget Sullivan's concealed body, the documentary evidence of the Whitmore's crimes, and information about each of the victims. Thousands of people visited the exhibition, many of them moved to tears by the stories of young immigrant women whose lives had been cut short and whose deaths had gone unpunished for so long. The empty chair in the photograph became a powerful symbol, representing all the absent victims whose stories deserved to be told. The most difficult part of the investigation came when Sarah and Elizabeth had to contact the living descendants of the victims. Patrick Sullivan's descendants were found in Boston, where Patrick had eventually settled after his unsuccessful search for his sister. His great-great-grandson, James Sullivan, a retired schoolteacher, was shocked to learn what had happened to the sister Patrick had spent his life mourning. James told Sarah that family stories had always mentioned Patrick's lost sister, how he had searched for her until his death at 73, never knowing her fate. For James, the discovery brought both grief and closure. He traveled to Chicago for Bridget's reburial in a Catholic cemetery, where she was finally laid to rest with proper rites. Anna Kowalski's family was traced to Milwaukee, where her brother's descendants still lived. Maria Kowalski Johnson, Anna's great-great-niece, had heard stories about the missing relative, though the details had become confused over generations. Some family members had believed Anna ran away to avoid an arranged marriage. Others thought she had died in a factory accident and was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. Learning the truth was devastating, but also validating. The family had always sensed that something terrible had happened to Anna, and now they knew they had been right to refuse to accept the easier explanations that would have allowed them to forget her. Mary Chen's descendants proved hardest to locate. Chinese immigrants in early 20th century America had faced tremendous discrimination and barriers to documentation. Officer Park, whose own family had immigrated from Korea generations later, took special interest in Mary's case. He worked with Chinese-American genealogical societies and community organizations, eventually finding descendants in San Francisco. Mary's great-great-granddaughter, Lisa Chen, was a civil rights attorney who had fought her entire career against the kind of injustices that had allowed her ancestors' murder to go unpunished. For Lisa, the discovery was both personally painful and professionally significant. She wrote an article for a legal journal about how systematic discrimination had enabled crimes against immigrant women to be ignored by authorities. Elena Rodriguez's family was found in El Paso, Texas, where her parents had eventually settled after leaving Chicago, heartbroken and empty-handed. Her great-great-grandson, Miguel Rodriguez, was a police detective himself. He understood immediately the significance of Sarah's cold case investigation. Miguel told Sarah that his family had maintained a small shrine for Elena, keeping her memory alive, even though they had never known what happened to her. The shrine included letters she had sent home before her disappearance, describing her dreams of saving enough money to bring her whole family to America and help them build a better life. Those dreams had died in the Whitmore garden, buried along with her body. The two unidentified victims haunted Elizabeth and Sarah. They knew these were also somebody's daughters, sisters, possibly mothers or wives. But without names, without families to notify, their deaths seemed even more tragic. Dr. Walsh suggested that DNA analysis might eventually lead to identification if descendants could be found and tested. Sarah arranged for the remains to be preserved with the hope that advancing technology might someday provide answers. In the meantime, the two unknown women were buried together in a cemetery plot donated by a local immigrant rights organization. Their shared headstone read, "Unknown sisters, victims of injustice. Your names are forgotten, but your lives mattered." The reburials of all 6 victims became major community events attended by hundreds of people from Chicago's immigrant communities. Speakers talked about how little had changed in some ways, how immigrant women still faced exploitation and danger, how the vulnerable still needed protection and justice. But they also celebrated the fact that even after more than a century, truth had prevailed. The victims' stories had been recovered, their deaths acknowledged, their killers exposed even if punishment was no longer possible. 6 months after the discovery of the photograph, Elizabeth Hartman stood in the Chicago Historical Society's conservation lab, carefully preparing the Whitmore family portrait for permanent preservation. The photograph had become one of the most significant artifacts in the Society's collection, a piece of evidence that had solved a century-old crime and brought closure to families who had waited generations for answers. But Elizabeth knew its significance went beyond this particular case. The photograph represented something larger, the power of evidence to survive, to wait patiently for someone to look closely enough to see the truth hidden in plain sight. Sarah Rodriguez had been promoted to head of the cold case unit, largely because of the Whitmore investigation's success. She had used the case to advocate for greater resources for cold case investigations, arguing that justice delayed was not necessarily justice denied. Her unit had expanded, bringing in specialists in historical research, forensic archaeology, and genealogical investigation. They were now reviewing hundreds of old unsolved cases, looking for new evidence or new investigative techniques that might finally provide answers. Sarah often thought about the empty chair in the Whitmore photograph, about Jonathan Whitmore's arrogant certainty that he would never be held accountable. She took satisfaction in proving him wrong, even posthumously. The Argentine government had conducted its own investigation into the Worth and Hartford families, as Jonathan Whitmore and Charles Hendricks had called themselves during their decades in Buenos Aires. Records showed that both men had lived prosperous lives, respected members of the British and American expatriate communities. They had died in their beds, wealthy and honored, never facing consequences for their crimes. Their descendants in Argentina had established a foundation in memory of the victims, donating money to organizations that supported immigrant women and fought human trafficking. It was a small gesture toward restitution for crimes they hadn't committed, but had benefited from through inherited wealth. Elizabeth published a comprehensive academic paper about the Whitmore case, examining how crimes against marginalized people were systematically ignored in the early 20th century. Her work sparked broader conversations about historical justice and the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate resolution seemed impossible. Other historians began examining their collections with new attention, wondering what other hidden crimes might be waiting to be discovered. The photograph had become a teaching tool used in forensic science programs, history courses, and criminal justice training to illustrate the importance of careful observation and persistence in investigation. Robert Morrison collaborated with technology companies to develop new imaging techniques based on the methods used to enhance the Whitmore photograph. These techniques were now being applied to other historical photographs and documents, revealing details that had been invisible for generations. The work had applications beyond solving old crimes. Historians used the technology to recover faded text in ancient documents. Art conservators detected hidden layers in paintings, and archaeologists analyzed photographs from early excavations to identify artifacts that had been overlooked. On the anniversary of the photograph's discovery, the Chicago Historical Society held a memorial service for all 6 victims. Patrick Sullivan's descendant, James, spoke about his great-great-grandfather's lifelong search for his sister and how meaningful it was to finally know her fate. The other families shared similar stories of loss, frustration, and now closure. Sarah spoke about how the case had changed her understanding of justice, teaching her that the passage of time didn't erase the importance of truth or the need for accountability. Elizabeth concluded the service by reading from Virginia Ashworth's diary, the society matron who had sensed something wrong in the Whitmore household but had lacked the power or courage to investigate further. Elizabeth noted that modern viewers of the photograph might wonder how anyone could have posed for such an image, knowing what was hidden behind them. But she reminded the audience that people in positions of power have always been skilled at hiding their crimes, at compelling silence from those who know, at using their status to avoid scrutiny. The Whitmore photograph was unusual only because the evidence had survived, and someone had finally looked closely enough to see it. As the service ended and people filed out slowly, Elizabeth remained behind, standing before the enlarged photograph that dominated one wall of the exhibition space. She looked at the empty chair, at the family's carefully composed faces, at the shadows that had hidden Bridget Sullivan's body for so long. The photograph had done what evidence is supposed to do. It had survived, it had spoken, and it had demanded justice. Even after 124 years, even after all the principals were long dead, truth had found its way into the light. Elizabeth turned off the lights in the exhibition hall, but she left one small spotlight illuminated, focused on that empty chair, a silent witness to crimes that would never be forgotten again. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity, So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.